Welcome to another real-world SF-50 flying video. This one is titled A Quick Review of SIDS and Stars. Hello, I'm David Weeks. I've been flying professionally for over 50 years, starting as a CFI, then a charter pilot in Light Twins. I spent time as an air ambulance pilot in a Swearingen Metro, and I flew as a demonstration pilot for the Learjet factory. I had a 35-year airline career flying the 737-200 and 300, the A320 series, and I retired as a Boeing 787 captain. I've got over 650 hours in the SF-50, and I'd like to share my VisionJet experiences with you. Now, there may be other YouTube channels that have glitzier production values than this one. I like to spend my time writing and teaching about the SF-50, not doing post-production work, so just imagine this video is like a hangar chat session between friends. If you want to follow along when I have approach plates or charts on screen, I'll provide links to them in the show notes. First, I do want to state clearly that the procedures in the Cirrus VisionJet airplane flight manual are always controlling. This video is not flight instruction. As you know, a SID is a standard instrument departure and a STAR is a standard terminal arrival route. Both of these procedures are commonly used at busy airports to standardize traffic flow and to make it easier to assign complex routings and altitudes without the controller having to spell out all the details over the radio. While it's possible to not accept a clearance for a SID or a STAR, every well-trained VisionJet pilot needs to be totally comfortable with doing them correctly. You won't be very welcome at big airports otherwise. Let's look at SIDs first. We'll start with the Logan 8 departure from Dallas-Fort Worth, KDFW. As you can see, this is a complex procedure. I would strongly advise you to review the plate carefully before you fly it for the first time. It has separate routes for each of the 4 possible departure runways and different altitude restrictions as well. Even if you get this departure unexpectedly with your IFR clearance, you need to take the time before engine start to learn your expected departure runway and then review the plate. If the departure runway is not obvious from the ATIS, just ask the controller working clearance delivery. If your clearance comes from PDC, pre-departure clearance procedure, you can still call clearance delivery to find out. Once you know the departure runway, you can check your required climb grading. Dallas is not in the mountains, and the climb grading requirement stops at 1,120 feet MSL, which is only 514 feet AGL. When loading the SID into the procedure page of the G3000, if you can't find the correct departure or runway, remember that some departures are runway specific, so make sure that you start with the assigned or planned SID and then choose the correct runway. Only the runways allowed by the SID will be displayed. Or, if you know that you need a specific runway for some reason, you can choose the runway and then the list of SIDs will show those SIDs for your chosen runway. When setting up the flight director after engine start, make sure that you arm both VNAV and FLC, flight level change. Check the scoreboard to make sure that VNAV is armed. When VNAV is armed, a white V to the left of the armed mode indicating VNAV is armed. Doing a VNAV climb will allow the G3000 to alert you if you will not be able to make an at or above climb restriction. Just arming flight level change alone will not provide that warning, and you may climb through an at or below altitude restriction. If the current vertical speed is insufficient to make an altitude restriction, the unable VNAV altitude system message will be shown. If this message comes up, what can you do? If you've been climbing with the auto throttle set in FMS mode, you may elect to switch to manual mode and then adjust the desired airspeed to a slower speed to increase the rate of climb. Don't slow below 120 knots indicated as that's the best angle of climb speed in the clean configuration. Yes, we may be slower than the best rate of climb speed, but when we have to cross a fix at or above a certain altitude, it's the climb gradient we're concerned with. As always, if you think you're going to have a problem making a restriction, tell ATC ASAP. Don't wait until you're a mile from the fix and 800 feet too low to let the controller know you can't make it. Separation from other aircraft may very well be compromised. Verifying all the fixes and crossing restrictions to make sure the SID and flight plan match is critical. When you're when you're cleared to climb via the SID and are doing a VNAV climb, the proper technique is to set the top altitude into the altitude selector. Note that the top altitude for a runway 31 departure is different than the top altitude for all the other runways. Again, gotchas such as this are why you should carefully brief the SID in advance and not during the taxi out. In a VNAV climb, the G3000 will comply with the various restrictions. It'll level off or at or below restrictions below the depicted top altitude and then resume the climb after passing the restriction. When you load the SID, again, make sure you load the correct runway into the G3000 and also any transition. This is critical as the DFW West runways have a totally different route than the DFW East runways. It would be unpleasant if you flew the route for the wrong runway. In fact, tower phraseology for RNAV departures is very specific and it includes the first fix. For example, Vision 130 Mike Hotel, RNAV to B Park, runway 18 left, cleared for takeoff. This is ATC's way of reminding you of the first fix on the SID. You must absolutely look at either the two fix shown in magenta below the HSI or at the active fix in the flight plan page to verify that what you see is what ATC has cleared you for. If not, do not accept the clearance and tell Tower you are not ready. Don't try to change the flight plan on the fly, so to speak. Note that the max 240 knot speed restriction for north and south departures. We'll be flying a lot slower, probably around 165 knots. DFW is a major air carrier hub, and I think it's both important and polite to let ATC know that we'll be climbing a lot slower than all of the air carrier jets. When picking up your clearance, tell clearance delivery, November 130 Mike Hotel will be climbing out at 165 knots indicated. Please advise departure. Now, if you get your clearance via PDC, you still need to call clearance delivery to let ATC know. Once airborne, the G3000 will transition to GPS mode at 400 feet AGL and off you go to the first fix. Now, do not wait to engage the autopilot as precise navigation is required for RNAV departures. If you drift off course even slightly, you can endanger separation from departures on the other side of DFW. Departing DFW is not a good time to practice hand flying in formation with a big jet departing the parallel runway. Once airborne, your main task will be monitoring climb performance and crossing altitudes and talking to ATC, so off you go. Stars. Let's examine the CHINS 5 arrival into Seattle, KSCA. You may also be assigned this star if you are landing at Boeing Field or Renton Airport. I think this plate is a fine example of the FAA trying to jam too much information onto one piece of paper or iPad screen. There's a lot going on, and you need to start your review of the star early, certainly well before actually beginning it. The best place is in an easy chair at home before you even head to the airport. This one plate has procedures for north and south landings at Seattle, and the crossing restrictions and final headings are quite different for both directions. Now, from your pre-flight planning, you should be aware of the Seattle surface wind. En route, check the Seattle weather when you're about an hour out, and then you can brief the procedure in earnest. Now, wait, what? If the winds are calm, or for some reason you're not sure of the landing runway, or you're too far out to get the ATIS, there are a few tricks you can try. One, when you're about 150 miles out or so, ask the center controller what's the landing runway or direction of landing at your destination. Two, in the SF-50 with its sat phone, you can usually call the phone number listed in ForeFlight for the ATIS. First, a few words about managing the route in the flight plan page. The Smart SF50 researches the route ahead of time. ForeFlight can display numerous recent routes to your destination. This can be very helpful when you're going into a busy destination. If you're dropping into a Class Bravo airport, you can bet your route will involve a star. Filing direct to Chicago O'Hare, KORD, from 1,000 miles away just is not going to happen, so don't waste your time trying. If you really can't figure out the best routing, one pro tip is to actually file a flight plan with your desired route, then see what comes up in ForeFlight after the FAA computers have chewed up your request. Then just cancel the flight plan and you'll know what to file when departure time is closer. If you get the star on the ground as part of your clearance, then just enter it. If you don't get the star on the ground and you do get it when en route, you need to be careful to properly manage the flight plan. If you get cleared to a fix that is on the star but is not part of your flight plan, and then commence the star from that fix, it's easy to end up with a flight plan that has a lot of now extraneous fixes in it. One technique, and there are many, is to enter the new fix before the destination. Then go to the procedure page, enter the star and the correct transition. The fix you were cleared to should either be the first fix on the transition or be named as one of the fixes later on the transition. It's common to see XYZ as the active fix as you went direct to it as cleared, but see XYZ again lower down on the legs page as that is part of the star. If you see that, just go direct to the second XYZ that came up as being part of the star. And for now, don't worry about the fixes that are before the cleared to fix. I strongly recommend that once you finish tapping on the GTC2 window, that you verify the correctness of what you've entered using the MFD to display the star plate. The magenta line should be the cleared to fix, and then check the crossing restrictions on the flight plan page against the ones shown on the plate. You may prefer to display the star plate on your iPad if you use one, but verify the route and the altitude restrictions. Once you have the correct star and transition and the expected approach loaded, you may kill some time by deleting unneeded fixes. Most pilots are a little OCD, and this may feel good. But in the Garmin universe, having a bunch of extra fixes behind you, not ahead, but behind you, really doesn't matter at all. Let's assume that Seattle is landing south. Unfortunately, until we have the ATIS, we can't be certain of which 3 possible landing runways will be assigned. But that won't affect our ability to comply with the crossing restrictions as the procedures for landing north or landing south. Make sure you're looking at the correct blocks of information. On stars that serve multiple airports, as does this one, be careful that you don't try to comply with the restriction for another airport. For example, the big block of text below the Seattle VOR has information for aircraft landing at Renton and Boeing Field. The restrictions for Seattle are contained in the All Others block at the bottom. Hopefully, from knowing the winds favor landing south, you've already have the star entered. You can pick a runway, and that can easily be changed later. Verify the crossing altitude, speeds, and final heading. When ATC gives us the star clearance, the controller will say the following. November 130 Mike Hotel, descend via the Chins 5 arrival, landing south. When you read back the clearance, you must include the landing south. That is how ATC knows that you know which set of restrictions to comply with. If you omit the direction, the controller is going to prompt you for the complete readback. At some airports like Phoenix Sky Harbor, KPHX, the star specifies the landing runway and not a direction. In that case, read back the landing runway along with the name of the star. Set the altitude selector for the bottom or the lowest altitude restriction. For our south landing, that's 12,000 feet at Auburn. The G3000 knows the RADI restriction of 270 knots at or above 16,000, and will calculate the appropriate top of descent point. Earlier, I spoke about being polite and informing ATC that we would be a slow climber. But on this star, it is mandatory that we tell ATC that we cannot comply with a 270 knot speed at RADI. Don't wait until you're into the descent to tell ATC. I think the ideal time to tell ATC of your planned descent speed is before you get the descent via clearance, and certainly no later than the receipt of the clearance. My personal preference is to set my FMS VNAV descent speed to 0.52 Mach, crossing over to 210 knots indicated. I tell ATC that's my preferred speed, but I can go as fast as 240 knots. If ATC asks me for 240 knots, I use manual mode on the auto throttle rather than go back into the G3000 and reprogram the VNAV speed settings. One other reason to plan a slower speed descent than 245 knots indicated or so is that the G3000 does not take winds aloft into account when calculating the top of descent. It assumes no wind. The autopilot will adjust pitch to maintain the programmed vertical descent angle, and the auto throttle will adjust power to maintain the programmed Mach number or indicated airspeed. With a strong tailwind, your ground speed will be much faster than the G3000 expected, so the required rated descent to hold the programmed vertical descent angle will be higher, and the auto throttle will reduce power to hold the programmed speed, even if that means flight idle. But even at flight idle, you may be going too fast when staying on the programmed descent angle. The autopilot will still try to hold the programmed descent angle, and the plane will overspeed. This is the reason to not plan VNAV descents at 240 or 245 knots indicated. You have no speed margin if there is a strong tailwind that the G3000 has not taken into account. Once you have reached the top of descent, the G3000 auto throttle will manage the descent to comply with crossing restrictions and speeds. It's not uncommon to be vectored off the start, especially as the SF50 is often a speed bump for air traffic control. Most air carrier jets descend at 280 knots or much faster, and even when ATC tries to plan ahead, we're just slow and in the way. If you are vectored off the star, ATC is required to specify an assigned altitude, and this is very important. If you don't get an assigned altitude when vectored off, ask for one. The star published altitudes do not guarantee terrain separation when you're not on the star itself. Now, at some point, the controller will clear you to a fix on the star or give you a heading to re-intercept it. At that point, he should reissue the descent via or a specific altitude, and you can re-enter the appropriate altitude or specific altitude in the altitude selector. Speed adjustments. Sometimes ATC will assign a speed in the descent before you reach a fix with a speed constraint. The controller should be clear about whether or not he wants you to maintain that speed or comply with the published speed. For example, November 130 Mike Hotel maintain 240 knots but comply with the speeds at Bozo. The chart shows Bozo at 210, so you fly 240 knots and slow when required to cross Bozo at 210. Or you may get November 130 Mike Hotel maintain 240 knots until Bozo. The chart shows Bozo at 210, so you fly 240 knots, cross Bozo at 240, and then slow to the published speed. And on another day, the controller may say, November 130 Mike Hotel maintain 240 knots until advised. This means just what it sounds like. Fly 240 until told to slow down. And as always, ask ATC if you have any questions. Radio calls are free. Since we're landing south, the restriction at Auburn does apply. So we need to monitor the G3000 to make sure we cross Auburn at 12,000 and the speed previously negotiated with ATC, since we cannot do 270 at RADI or 250 at Auburn. Make sure the airplane then flies the 343-degree heading after Auburn. At this point, ATC is going to vector you for the approach to the landing runway. Reconfirm the landing runway and approach, and then you may choose to engage vectors to final. Now, if you've been flying the arrival in FMS mode and have autothrottle, be aware that depending on how you have set your VNAV preferences, the FMS and autothrottle will slow you to 180 knots or slower when you are within 10 miles of the airport. Do not let this happen. This is a good way to get run over from behind at a big airport. Once you cross the last fix that has a speed restriction, my technique is to select manual mode and stay at that speed until slowed by ATC. If you want to slow down earlier, just tell ATC that you want to slow to your desired speed, and you should be able to get a slower speed. But at most airports that use stars, you should plan on vectors to the downwind at a speed around 210 and then slowing to around 170 for downwind, and that's easy to do in the SF50. The CHINS 5 star is complete. Okay, let's do a quick recap of what we discussed. Here's some common errors pilots make. 1. Not reading and briefing the chart well in advance. Ideally, look over the chart before the flight, and certainly don't wait until a few minutes before you need to start down. I use the annotation feature in ForeFlight to circle top and bottom altitudes and mandatory speeds. This helps if you wish to keep the chart open in ForeFlight as well, or instead of on the MFD. 2. Failing to verify the speeds and altitudes in the flight plan window with the numbers on the chart. This is essential and will help detect if you have mistakenly loaded the wrong arrival. 3. Not setting the top or bottom altitude as appropriate. Use the full power of the VNAV capability of the G3000 to manage intermediate level offs and also managing the descent between fixes. 4. Not telling ATC in advance about any inability to comply with required speeds or altitudes. 5. Slowing down unexpectedly when getting close to the airport. And 6. Not getting an altitude assignment if you're vectored off the star. This one is an ATC error, but pilots need to get one if ATC forgets. That's it for this SF50 real-world video. I hope you learned something about SIDS and stars that will help you understand them and fly them better. I'm David Weeks. Thanks for watching.